lot of what I'm going to say, I think, is going to connect up to what we've been talking about this morning, particularly about mission of education, because I think at the core of all of this conversation is we're misoriented, fundamentally misoriented, in terms of what the intention of education is. Right? And the other thing that we haven't been doing very well, I think, is bringing the participation in. That it's not just a brain, it's not just a machine, it's a human being, and the being has to participate. And it's the quality and health of that participation that has to be, I think, the kind of central organizing principle. Let me start that process of kind of our descent into this conversation today with this little piece on learning itself.
The Neurons to Neighborhoods report was very emphatic in stating that children are born ready to learn. We don't have to make them ready to learn. We don't have to teach them how to learn. They are kind of wired from the beginning to learn, and they're wired to experience and to master the world around them.
What is important about education? It's not that somebody knows the current science, because the current science might be wrong, but it's that somebody knows how to learn about new science and adapt to do something that they had never even thought about doing when they were in school. That's the key element.
So, on one hand, you've got somebody who's overseeing the gathering of what we have on neuroscience of early childhood development, saying that, in essence, we come into the world born learning-oriented, wired to differentiate and disambiguate and extend our presence into the worlds we inhabit. We come that way. On the other hand, we've got somebody who is sitting at the Hoover Institute studying education. I've also talked to other people in similar positions around the country who are studying kind of the macro dynamics of education, saying, what is it that makes education really work? And what he's come to is basically that what we need to do is be producing people that are learning-oriented. In other words, so we're born learning-oriented, and the purpose of education isn't so much to teach us any particular thing as it is to get us through the process able to learn in ways that we can't be educated about at the time we're being educated. So both of these two things. Now the difference between them, even though there seems to be such significant agreement between the two, is that one is talking about natural organic learning. We are wired, we come into the world with this kind of proprioceptive, self-sensing feedback that can differentiate and allow us to disambiguate our way into being more present in the world. We come with that. But we don't come with any such ability to be able to differentiate and extend ourselves into the artificial, cultural, technological world. And the purpose of education is to be able to connect that kind of natural internal learning orientation and make it able to learn in this artificial world. But for the most part, teachers, parents, educators, we're kind of oblivious to the difference between a natural learning context and an artificial learning context. And without it, I don't know how you could possibly organize education effectively. And there's no place better to go into, a lens into those differences than in understanding the code itself. So backdrop real quickly, our perspective is that everything depends on learning, our physical health or emotional health. Learning isn't just the process of utility for the acquisition of knowledge, skills, and experience. Learning is the central dynamic through which we become human beings. And it's not only connected to each and all of us as individuals, but it's connected to everything about us collectively as well. So our mission and what we do with our work at the Children of the Code Project and other things is what we call stewarding the health of learning. And that's the thought bomb kind of at the end. One other thing I'd ask for you to think about as I proceed on with this and into the Children of the Code conversation is that is to think about this question. What happens to children who develop a pre-conscious emotional aversion to the feeling of confusion? Talk about motivation. It's not just pumping up motivation. It's making sure that they don't become emotionally motivated to avoid learning, which is, when you deconstruct it, the #1 learning disability in this country. More than everything else we keep track of put together. And it's right there at the intersection between the emotion and cognitive dimensions of things that this conversation about reading takes place. So to set a backdrop for this, briefly, I want to say just a little bit about what Children of the Code means. It has two different meanings. One has to do with the power of this code and its effect on our world.
The bottom line of this is that the big step between us and animals is indeed language, but the big step between civilization and more primitive forms of human society is written language.
The fact is that the invention of a writing system, and then the adoption of writing systems around the world has been the thing that gives our modern societies their predominant character.
Well, it has enormous metacognitive implications. The power is this, that you can not only think in ways that you could not possibly think if you did not have the written word, but you can now think about the thinking that you do with the written word.
Once we start writing, we are able to then reflect back upon what we have written, and we enter into this kind of recursive relation to our own written signs. And so only then a certain degree or experience of self-reflection that we now sort of take for granted comes into being.
So on the one hand, we're all children of the code. More than any single invention in the history of history, this has changed everything about the world, our institutions, how they function, how they're organized. But it's also changed how we meta-reflect, how we relate to language itself. So it's just super critical on the one hand. On the other hand, this is recapitulated with each child.
If I read a book and then I feel like a lot smarter.
Does reading make you smarter? The answer is yes. Crystallized intelligence is just massively built by reading itself, okay? Independent of education, independent of fluid intelligence.
Ultimately, the measures of your cognitive abilities tend to move down in the direction of your reading abilities.
Having said that on the one hand, that this is building the infrastructure for high-speed abstraction, for a complex virtual assembly, right? I mean, reading, after all, is a code-instructed and informed virtual reality system that projects a simulated language into comprehensibility in our minds. And it's all based on a huge number of variables about the early life learning trajectory of children and how well it prepares them for all of this. But when I said children of the code, I had two different meanings for it. One having to do with the effect that this has had on all of us, and the other one to understand the effect that this is having on children.
Approximately of young African-American kids can't read. 70%. If you look at Hispanic kids, 65 to 70%.
And as we know, a majority of students do not read at the proficient level.
64% of 12th graders in this country are below proficient. 88% of African-American fourth grade children. 78% of Hispanic children. You can argue quite a bit with NAEP and how much you want to discount it, but it's still enormously significant. And what that means when you translate it to proficiency is those children that are not proficient, that their entire educational experience as channeled through the requirements of literacy to access what's going on in school, they're underwater, it's muddled. Their brain energy, their learning participation is weakened, their learning challenges they're experiencing are exacerbated by the degree of difficulty associated with the reading.
93 million adults out of a total adult population of around 221 million are at basic literacy levels or below basic.
The collective costs on this is measured in the hundreds of billions. It's close to $1 trillion a year. It dwarfs the cost of war on crime, drugs, everything else that you can imagine. It's the single biggest expense of education. And for the most part, this connects to the conversation we're having about teaching in general, is that teachers have become, and I've talked to hundreds of them and dozens of people that study teacher behavior, they've become robotic conscripts to protocols of instruction that they don't first person understand. So the center of this difficulty is a form of confusion.
How do you feel when you read?
My brain hurts.
It hurts?
My brain my head started hurting. It's like it kept on boom, 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 just beating. I didn't even know the word. I don't even know what's going on in my head. I didn't. I was like, what is this word? I can't figure it out.
It's pretty difficult, like putting some sounds to these symbols, knowing the difference between one and another, and knowing that some are numbers and some are letters, and that you can put them together and they form a completely different thing.
I get confused a lot because I'll sit there and I get frustrated. It's no fun. I don't like reading.
I can't understand what it's saying.
We're talking about children experiencing a form of confusion that's unnatural to their organism.
I think that's an interesting and good way to frame things.
I suspect that most letters that are in your sort of foveal zone, or the area right around your fixation, are probably being processed pretty much in parallel. So I don't think we need to think of them as, one 25 milliseconds, another 25 milliseconds, but averaged over them, it's going to be about 25 milliseconds, yeah. Very fast, staggeringly fast. There's time that's involved in moving the eyes from one place to another, so that the latency, just the simple motor reaction time of the eye, is about 150 milliseconds at least. So there's not a lot of time in there to process the information that you're looking at. Most of the time it appears that the eyes are being driven largely by lexical processing of the words, so that when there's higher order comprehension issues that are coming in, there will be times when the eyes will slow down for that. But for the most part, the eyes are being driven by how easy or hard the word is.
Well, in English, get the hook.
I knew the letter names. It was like the sounds and the bigger words, and the words that, like, when you sound them out, they aren't pronounced the way they sound.
I mean, I'm sounding them out like I've been taught, but it just ain't, I don't know, it just don't work. Because, they tell you to sound out, and then, you got vowels, and some of them are silent, and it's just like, well, these two work together to make this, and it's like, huh? I mean, it's just like, it's so confusing.
Si, ka, s, ch, sh. O, ow, ah, wa, oo. M, P, p. A, ah.
This goes on, it takes a couple of minutes for it to play out, so I got to shorten it. But I would say, as I move from this particular thing back to here, what we're describing is a form of confusion that a child's mind has, a tenth of a second or so on average to resolve, to disambiguate the letter-sound correspondences. Remember that language itself is operating with a temporal profile. It's moving at an incredible rate. The process of reading actually has to artificially simulate at that rate, or it's not comprehensible. Right? So there's this incredible assembly, and at that assembly rate, this confusion has to be worked out. If that confusion isn't, if the life learning trajectory of the child at the point that they intercept this confusion hasn't prepared them for their brain to work preconsciously that fast to disambiguate this code sound situation, they start to become in danger.
What must it be like to come to school every day, right? And school is going to be all about the thing that you don't do well.
Spending any amount of time in classrooms where children are working on beginning reading instruction, you can almost watch children who are struggling begin to turn off and exhibit behaviors that are going to interfere with their learning.
I remember feeling pretty dumb.
I wasn't smart. I thought I was not smart because I couldn't read like everybody else could.
Growing up, I thought it was me the whole time. I thought something was wrong with me.
So again, what happens? What happens when at an early age you develop an aversion to how bad it feels to feeling confused? And it starts to operate just like reading itself, faster than you're even aware of. It's underneath your consciousness, and it's causing your consciousness to avoid doing things that will cause you to feel confused because you don't want that shame. What happens to your life learning trajectory? That's why there's such a connection, I think, and the research we've done. We've conducted 120 plus interviews, 400 hours of tape. There's about 150 little videos like this of much greater length that are available on our website for those of you that are interested. I'd like to take I want to take a couple of more pops through this.
It's almost as though you have to mesh with that code in a time sync so that that sequencing and processing can happen, you know, in a kind of parallel way, so that all of those gears have to mesh. That's a lot of gears to mesh.
What we're really doing is we're taking something that is a nightmare for computation, and yet we have to turn it into, as we mature, both as language users but also as readers and writers, we have to automatize it so that we don't have to think about those details.
That is critically important, to the extent that I have to invest real cognitive energy in figuring out what that word is. I've lost the meaning of the sentence. It's gone, right?
The problem with automatization is that at any step, if you've got a slowdown step, if any piece of that enterprise has a block, or you can't hold enough of the information, the whole house of cards falls apart.
Here's the thing, that we as a society, parents, teachers, siblings, the way the school works, is that we conspire to cause children to feel like their inability to work out this confusion. Here they're 4, 5, 6, 7 years old. Their inability to resolve the confusion in this messy, archaic, technological artifact is somehow a reflection of something deeply wrong with them.
When kids are hesitant, disfluent, inaccurate, slow and labored in reading, that is very visible to the peers, and the peers, the other kids, again, look at reading as a proxy for intelligence. It doesn't matter if this kid is already a genius and can do algebra in the 2nd grade. Reading produces particular perceptions. Better said, lousy reading produces a perception of stupidity and dumbness to peers, and clearly to the youngster who is struggling. That is the shame.
When I was reading to my friend and I got stuck on a word, and then when it was at recess, I heard her talking, saying that like I can't read so good. It made me feel kind of scared that I'm not smart.
And I don't like reading out loud. I get embarrassed.
Pause that a second. What's everybody's consensus on the #1 fear that adults have in this country? Speaking out loud. What is it we ask 5- and 6-year-old kids to do in the classroom? While in the process of learning this convoluted, complex, horribly, confused process?
Being asked to read out loud in front of a class, which is a very typical elementary school reading activity, can be a terribly humiliating situation.
My teacher asked me to come into the front of the class and read a book, and everybody was just staring at me, and I got real nervous because I didn't want to mess up or anything. And then when I started reading, I started messing up, and I just couldn't help it, and everybody started laughing at me and stuff. So,
like, the teacher would ask me to read something, and I would read it, and I'll get a wrong word, or I'll go too slow, and they'll make fun of me.
I kept messing up on the words, and people kept laughing at me.
They said that you don't know how to read. I bet you won't be able to how to read when you grow up. They always laugh at me if I get twisted up with words. It makes my heart drop, because it seems like they're not my friend no more.
Ever since then, I've been comfortable reading in front of people, and they made fun of me and stuff, so I just never really liked to read after that.
The greater the number of experiences of reading in which a child experiences shame, the more likely it is that every experience of reading is going to be associated with the expectation of shame.
So nervous. I'm nervous.
Nervous.
Makes me feel shy.
Shy? What does shy mean?
when you're scared to do something and there's a whole bunch of people around.
I'd start sweating. I'd be like, I don't know if I'd literally start sweating, but I would. I'd get real nervous, and you could see that I was getting nervous and embarrassed.
So the point in all this is that we're not just talking about a machine when we talk about this brain. We're talking about somebody inside of it, an inhabitant, somebody who has feelings. And those feelings, the emotions, the affect, is actually regulating what they're able to pay attention to, how long they're able to pay attention to. And once that emotional circuitry doesn't want to be paying attention, you can do all you want in the classroom, and you've got to fight against that. And in fact, most of the kids that are struggling are no longer struggling just with the original issues. They're become learning disabled by the emotional avoidance they have to wanting to get anywhere near the confusion. So I wish I had more time. That's it for now.
This final panel was titled Transformation. The idea was that having gone through the other panels that we would have some sense of, or at least have the wherewithal to start thinking about where to go. And Paula particularly did not like the word translation, which I think other people have said. And so this is essentially a where do we go from here kind of meeting. Okay, David Boulton, you want to say something?
You know, I've been in this space for about 20 years, really concerned about the same issues that we've been talking about today. And I've come to believe that there is this movement going on, starting to move more towards the medicine model, right? But one of the things that goes on for medicine that doesn't go on for education, that's kind of one of its organizing principles, is above all else, do no harm. And that one of the monsters missing in this conversation is how much of our learning is being disabled by our learning. And that rather than having all of our learning, science, and research connected to the educational objective, that the Sputnik project and the NCF project and the kind of national thing that I would most advocate is the creation of the kind of National Institute for the Study and Prevention of Acquired Learning Disabilities. Somebody needs to be looking out for that side, kind of independent of all the agenda to push what we think people should be learning. And let that not be subordinate to the entire educational mechanism, but a parallel informing loop to all of this.